Books, books, I love books. I'm gonna read them all. Hi readers, Chris here. Today I'm going to be doing a special video, and that is an update on my Stephen King journey. If you've been with me for a while, you will know that a few years back I started a journey to read all of Stephen King's books by publication date, which is becoming increasingly more difficult because he seems to release a new book every single year. About a year ago, I did kind of an introduction video to this journey of mine. I will link it down below. However, I will warn you if you go back and watch it. It was in my early booktube days, so it doesn't have the best video and audio sounding, so just keep that in mind. But anyway, today I want to talk about the 80s. The 80s were an amazing time for Stephen King. He published 18 fiction stories in the 80s. Yes, that's right. That does not even include like nonfiction or short stories. We're talking 18 fiction books. Everything with Firestarter all the way to the dark half. So I've reviewed a lot of these books already on booktube, but what I really want to do today is just really talk about Stephen King in the 80s, talk about some of my favorite books, some of my least favorites, and everything else that kind of falls in the middle. So again, the 80s was an amazing time for Stephen King. His first published book, Carrie, he published in the 70s, and then he had a number of hits throughout the 70s. Some you'll probably recognize, like Salem's Lot, The Shining, The Stand. So all of these are now like really known books. But once we got to the 80s, that is where like Stephen King really took off and really established himself as like a horror writer. Or I should say, not just a horror writer, but like the ultimate horror writer. So we're talking about things like It, Cujo, Pet Sematary. There are so many amazing books that he did in the 80s. So I'm going to talk about my 5 favorite books from the 80s, starting with Firestarter, that was published in 1980. Firestarter is, for all intents and purposes, a story about a young girl that basically has the power to start fires with her mind. Now, the reason that she has this ability is because her mother was experimented on when she was pregnant. Now she has this crazy power, and her father, who is her only parent left alive, are on the run from the government because the government, hey, they paid for this experiment. They know she has this power. They want to use her, but she's not really into that. When the story starts out, she is a young girl. She kind of doesn't have any control over this power. She doesn't really understand what is going on. So what follows is like not only a story of like finding your own power, but like it's almost like a coming of age story. So it's a coming of age story that's both supernatural, fantasy, and horror at times. It is a really cool story. And this story has been readapted into movies, into TV shows most recently. It's got a whole bunch of adaptations along the years. I haven't seen all of them, but from the ones I have seen, I will say that I do think that the book, Firestarter, is the best version of this story. So if you have not read it, I would definitely say Firestarter is an amazing book. And if you've never read Stephen King before, this one is honestly a really good place to start because it does have horrifying moments, but it's not like that like creepy monster gore. Like it's not all that type of stuff. Like the horror in it is really more interpersonal horror, the horror of running from like a faceless organization. Like there's a lot of cool stuff in here that is horrifying, but it's not the typical stuff that you would think of when you think of horror. And again, this is just one example of like how Stephen King really broke the mold for horror and went outside. Just like horror doesn't have to be, you know, monsters and vampires and blood and gore. Horror can be something completely different. The horror of everyday life and the horror of people and how they treat each other, and this is an amazing example of that. Another favorite book of mine from the 80s, this one was published in 1983, and that is Christine. And I do have to admit, I am a little biased because my name is also Christine, although I spell mine with a K and this is with a C. But regardless, on the surface, this is a very simple story. It's about a young boy. He finds a car that's kind of beat up and run down. He buys it. It's his first car. And then slowly over the course of the story, Christine starts to take a life of her own. Christine starts to come to life, and Christine is not a good car. She is not a good car. So I would probably not in real life want Christine as my first car, but this book is amazing for multiple reasons. And again, this whole theme of like coming of age, that is something that Stephen King does a lot in his stories over and over and over again. And we have these two boys, and the point of view of this story is not actually told from the boy that buys the car, that buys Christine. It's actually from his friend. So his friend sees what's happening. He sees what's going on with Christine. He sees what this car is doing to his best friend, but there's nothing he can do about it. This book does such a good job building tension. From the very first scene where they see Christine on the side of the road to the climax and what happens at the end, it very slowly builds tension. Very, very slowly. And again, this is another thing that King does a lot, and some people either love it or some people don't like it. But he does these stories that are like a really slow burn. And sometimes I think that works, like in here. Sometimes it does bother me. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the payoff in this book is amazing. So yes, it's a slow burn, but you know where things are going. You know going into this book that Christine is evil. You know things are going to get bad. But it doesn't matter that you know, because it's all about the journey. And the journey that these two friends go through, the journey that they go through dealing with this evil car is just amazing. It's just amazing. When I read this book, I was like on the edge of my seat. I had chills. I was like, oh my God, like it's so creepy. It's so amazing. It's so much fun. Like creepy can be fun, and this book is 100% totally fun. Trust me, it's totally fun if you are into thrillers or anything like that. Definitely give Christine a try if you have not read it. My next favorite book from the 80s, published in 1986, and that is going to be It. Yes, It. Even if you've never read It, you probably are familiar with it. You're probably familiar with Pennywise the Clown. This book is the longest book I have ever read in my entire life. It's over 1,100 pages long. Wow. Now, I have done a full breakdown of this book. I've done a 1-minute review on this book. I've talked a lot about it on my channel. And again, I will link in the description box below any of my reviews that I've done for these books in case you want to look them up. But what I want to focus on today, what I really want to focus on for this book in particular, is the way that it's written. I did talk about this in my review, but the way that this book is written is absolutely amazing. It's genius, and it is like nothing I have ever read before. Ever. Nothing I have ever read before. This book takes place in 2 timelines. We have one timeline where we have a group of kids. They're called the Losers Club, and they stumble upon this evil force that's taking over their town. That's Pennywise the Clown. And then on the other timeline, these same kids are grown up. They've kind of left this stuff behind. They don't even really remember what happened in their childhood, but they know that Pennywise has come back and they need to do something to end him once and for all. In the beginning of the book, these two timelines are very far apart. And what I mean by that is like, we'll have 5 or 10 chapters in one timeline, and then we have 5 or 10 chapters in the other timeline. But as the story continues, and as you get closer to the end, those timelines start to get closer and closer together. So instead of having 10 chapters in one timeline and 10 chapters in another, it's, 5 and 5, and then it's 4 and 4, and then it's 3 and 3. And then all of a sudden you get to the end and every other chapter is alternating timelines, and it almost gets to every other page. Like, these two timelines converge, not only like in the story, but like they physically converge in the book. And I've never read a book that's written like that. I never have read a book that it is constructed in such a way that not only does the story actually converge, but like the physical pages converge. It's a really wild way to write. I don't know how he did it, but if anything, reading this book really cemented for me that Stephen King is a genius. And yes, if you are a fan of Stephen King, you already know that. He has a lot of great books, but there are just certain books that are like, they're just above and beyond. They are next level, and it is next level. I love the movies. I love the adaptation, Tim Curry, Pennywise. I love all that stuff. But to me, again, the book is the best version of this story, and it is the best version for a reason. It is truly a masterpiece. Next up, published in 1987, I have Misery. Dun, da, da, da. If you've been following my channel for a while, you will know that Misery is one of my favorite books of all time. As much as I love it and appreciate it for being a masterpiece, I love Misery for a different reason, and I love Misery for a personal reason. Reading is all about like what you get out of it. Two people can read the exact same book and have two completely different experiences. One person can read Misery and say, oh, it's about an author who gets kidnapped by a fan and gets his legs cut off. Ooh, scary. That's one person. A second person can read this book and be like, wow, this is a really deep exploration of fandom, of what it means to be an author, a writer, of what it means to have a relationship with your fans, of what it means to be a fan and be a fan of something. There are so many layers of Misery, so many different layers, and you're only going to get out of it like what you want to get out of it. And Misery is one of the books that I get so much out of. I get so much out of Misery, so much. Again, it is a story about an author who gets kidnapped by a crazy fan. There is so much good stuff in here. There's commentary on being a writer, on being an author. There's commentary on being a fan and what that really means. There's commentary on mental health and the mental health industry. I love books that work on multiple levels, and this book works on so many levels that it is crazy. So again, I'll link my full review for Misery down below, but this is, so far in my journey, my absolute favorite Stephen King book. Last but not least, my 5th favorite Stephen King book of the 80s, published in 1989, is going to be The Dark Half. The Dark Half is about an author. Yes, Stephen King does write a lot of stories about authors, and this author has an alter ego that takes on a life of its own. This is, again, another story that kind of works on multiple levels. Stephen King, in his early years, did publish a couple stories under a pseudonym, and that was Richard Bachman. So he has a bunch of tales that he wrote under this Richard Bachman persona, and the author in this book also writes under a pseudonym. It just so happens that in this case, this pseudonym takes on a life of its own, and he is very evil. He kills people. He does some crazy stuff. So this book is really fun. It's really fun. I don't know how else to explain it. I knew nothing going into this book. I didn't even really read the description. I just kind of went in blind because it was the next book on my Stephen King list. And I found this book to be really entertaining. Like, it's creepy and it's got some disturbing parts, but it's also really fun at the same time. It's fun because you have this author who's trying to convince like a policeman and investigator that like, hey, it's not me that's doing all these things. It's this other person, entity that is me but isn't me. Like, it sounds bizarre. It is bizarre. It's wild and crazy, but I found it a lot of fun. So again, if you're looking for an introduction to Stephen King, but you're looking for something that's more like on the horror side of things, The Dark Half is a great place to start. It's not that long of a read compared to some of his books anyway. It moves along pretty fast. It's not a slow burn. It moves along pretty quickly, and it's really fun. And it's creepy. I don't know what else I can say about it other than I really enjoyed The Dark Half, and I think you would too. All right, now that I've talked about all the good books that came out in the 80s, now I'm going to talk about some of my least favorite, starting with this collection of novellas, Different Seasons. Now, don't get me wrong, there are 4 novellas in here, and I do like some of them. Specifically, Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption. That is the basis for the movie Shawshank Redemption. That's a great story. However, there are some other stories in here that really kind of left me scratching my head. The one I'll mention here is known as Apt Pupil. And Apt Pupil is about a young boy who has an older man who's his neighbor. And he thinks that this older gentleman may or may not have been a Nazi in his past. And what happens is that he basically blackmails this man into telling him like all the horrible things that he did in the past. And this guy was just trying to like live a quiet life, but this young boy like reawakens something in him that was long gone. And what follows is just a series of absolutely horrific events. I mean, anything where you're talking about Nazis, it's probably not going to be a good time. So that story is horrifying in multiple ways, like for multiple reasons, and I really didn't enjoy it. Like, some things just like, I don't know how to explain it. We all have our thresholds of like what is too much, and that story hit that threshold for me. It was just too much for me, and I ended up it really made me feel uncomfortable, and I really didn't like it. There are one of the other novellas in here I kind of had a similar feeling about, but not as bad as Apt Pupil. So I would say, the Shawshank Redemption is definitely worth reading if you're going to read anything out of Different Seasons, but you don't need to read the other stories. Next up, published in 1983, is Cycle of the Werewolf. Cycle of the Werewolf is a story that I was super excited to read. I am a fan of comics and graphic novels, and this is an illustrated novella, an illustrated story. So I was super excited going into this. And it's also like a murder mystery. The basic premise is that there is a town. This town is being terrorized by a werewolf. The werewolf is someone within the town, but no one knows who it is. So it's kind of like a whodunit, a who is it with a werewolf, and some really awesome pictures. Also, every single chapter in here is a different month of the year. So starting in January all the way through December, it kind of goes through like a year in this town and what happens. Again, I was really excited going in, but what ends up happening is that about halfway through, by April or June, they give away who the werewolf is. which I found really annoying. I found that really annoying. Like, in a good mystery, you should not be able to guess who the killer is until the end. But there was no guessing in this story. They just hand it to you. They just give it to you. It's not like, oh, I guessed it. No, it's 100% completely obvious. They tell you who the werewolf is, which I found super disappointing, super disappointing. And again, that was just me. That was just what I got out of it. I know some people do enjoy this, and I do enjoy the style that it's in. I do enjoy the artwork that it's in. It's just the actual story left me pretty disappointed. Next up, published in 1984, and I know this one is a favorite to some, but I'm sorry to say it is The Talisman. Now, Stephen King wrote this in collaboration with Peter Straub. I have never read any of Peter Straub's other books. I don't know what kind of author he is. I don't really know anything about him. But I do know Stephen King. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, sometimes Stephen King has a tendency to have these very slow burns and these very drawn out stories. And I feel like The Talisman is like the ultimate example of a story that is just like so drawn out that it doesn't make any sense why it's drawn out so long. The basic setup of the story is that we have a young boy named Jack. He lives in our world. His mother is sick, and in order to save his mother's life, he basically goes on this like epic quest adventure to retrieve this magical object, the talisman, from an alternate universe. And this alternate universe is basically like our world, except like a darker version. That's like really simple explanation. But as he goes on this quest, this journey, all these various things happen to him along the way. And when you think about like a typical epic quest, epic adventure, when you think of like the classic version of that story, like all these things happen along the way, like, oh, I meet a guy, and oh, I do this, and oh, I do that, and I get trapped here. Like, there's a very random set of events that happens in this book. At least they felt random to me. Maybe there's something that I'm missing, but to me, almost everything that happens to Jack along his journey to the talisman is completely random and didn't make any sense. Like, there's this one scene where he goes to like a movie theater with a friend that he meets, and I'm like, I don't understand why that's in there, how it's relevant to the story. That's pretty much how I felt about every single piece of this story. Now, again, I know this book is popular among some, so if you are one of those people, I want to know in the comment section below what makes the talisman so interesting to you, because I didn't see it. Sorry. Next up, published in 1987, another book that is way too long, and that is the Tommyknockers. When I first started reading the Tommyknockers, I was pretty interested because it's basically about this town where there is this UFO that's been buried for a long time, or well, it doesn't say. There's a UFO that a townsperson uncovers, and as they start to dig up this UFO, all this crazy stuff starts happening in the town. And at first, I thought that this book was a commentary on nuclear power, because in the beginning of the book, there is a lot of talk about nuclear power. And you could say that there is like some of that in there, but it's really not. It's really not. The book really is about aliens. It's about the Tommyknockers, which are aliens. There are some parts in this book that are fun, that are good, that are like sci-fi horror, but considering that this book is almost 800 pages long, it's way too long. It's way too long. It takes way too long to get to the point. It follows all these different people in the town, which I don't think were necessary. It didn't add anything to the story. So again, similar to what I said about the Talisman, this one is just an example of when Stephen King really needs to rein it in, and he did not do that with this book. And then finally, another collection of, this time, short stories, and that is The Skeleton Crew. Stephen King has a lot of short story collections, novella collections. He had Night Shift that he came out with in the 70s, 4 Past Midnight, Skeleton Crew. But not all of these short story collections are good. Not all of them are good. And unfortunately, Skeleton Crew, I feel like, is one of the weaker ones. That doesn't mean that there aren't good stories in here. There are, like the one about the monkey is pretty creepy. But overall, there are way more stories that are meh or even bad, and not enough that are good and are exciting. When Skeleton Crew was published, he really only had one short story collection before this, which was Night Shift, which was published in the 70s. Night Shift, if you're looking for a short story collection, is amazing. Night Shift has story after story after story that are creepy, that are scary, that are fun. Skeleton Crew, not so much. There are some in here that are fun, but most of them just kind of made me feel, what was that? Or I don't know what I just read. So that is how I felt about Skeleton Crew. Like I mentioned before, there are a ton of other books that King published in the 80s, a ton of well-known ones like Cujo, Pet Sematary, The Gunslinger, which is the first book in his epic Dark Tower series. There's a lot of good stuff in the 80s. There's just a couple of stinkers in there as well. That brings me to the end of my Stephen King update for my journey. I am well into the 90s right now, so hopefully by this time next year I can do a 90s edition of my Stephen King journey. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not already, please subscribe to my channel. Share this video with your friends. It really helps me out. And as always, I will be back with more bookish videos soon. All right, everyone. Happy reading.